Well, welcome to our little video blog on the longer ending of Mark. I did say when I got to the end of preaching Mark's Gospel on Sunday that at some point this week I was going to try and make a video explaining why I'm not preaching those last few verses of Mark's Gospel that appear in some of our Bibles. Often there's a footnote explaining that they're not in the earliest and best manuscripts that we have, or something along those lines. But why is it that I decided not to preach on these? Why did I decide that they're probably not authentically words written by Mark himself? Well, I want to look at two bodies of evidence as we answer that question. The first one is actually just looking really at the text itself. So this is called Textual Criticism. It's looking at what we actually have in our Bibles. Let's have a look together then at chapter 16. And you'll see in verse 2 that we're told very clearly that very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, that's when the women go down to the tomb. They meet this young man who gives them a message and they run away scared. And so the ending line really is that trembling and bewildered, verse 8, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And there, supposedly, Mark signs off. And I guess some people didn't like that ending very much. But actually, when you read the next verse, the first thing I want to say is it really jars. You know, Mark has been a really good writer. He's a dramatic writer. And what he writes flows really quite nicely. But when you go from these women, who we've been told already in the first day of the week have gone to the tomb, fleeing afraid from the tomb because they're afraid, you then get this little next pause, and then the next sentence is, when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. It's a very repetitive continuation. We're being given a whole lot of information that we already had. What's more, Mary Magdalene is introduced there like as if we've never met her before. She's introduced as if for the first time, where we're given details about her. Now back in chapter 15, we were introduced to these women and we were told about them. Why reintroduce Mary in such a way? And we're given information about Mary that is in agreement with what we find in Luke's account. We're told that this is the Mary from whom Jesus drove 7 demons. Why this complete new introduction of Mary? Additionally, with regards to everything actually in these additional verses, everything that concerns the resurrection appearances, you can find all of that material, and in some cases in even greater detail, in the other Gospels anyway. You could have written this ending of Mark from reading the other Gospels, doing a bit of research on the other witnesses, and then just writing it down from them. There's no new information. And then there's the language itself. Firstly, in these last 12 verses, we're introduced to 18 new words in the Greek that appear nowhere else in the book. That's quite a jump in language, isn't it? Also, Mark has to this point, as you read through the Gospel, always referred to Jesus by his given name. But in verses 19 and 20, we see something interesting. Suddenly, he is being called for the first time in Mark's account, the Lord Jesus. And later on, the Lord. That's not typical of Mark. That doesn't sound like Mark writing anymore. Now, of course, that's not conclusive proof of the secondary nature of the text. But it's suggestive of an addition that was made in line with reverential Christian worship of the day, referring to Jesus by those kind of titles. Also, the emphasis on signs in verses 17 to 18 really does seem to be at odds with what we've read earlier on in the Gospel. Jesus' attitude towards signs, for example, in chapter 8, verse 12, is completely different. There we read that Jesus sighs deeply when he's asked to provide signs. And he says this, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given it." But perhaps the most concerning element here really is the content here in these verses that's theologically questionable. And there is a bit, even without getting into the whole issue of picking up snakes and drinking poison in verse 18. Verse 12 contains a somewhat troubling and unexplained description of Jesus' appearance to two disciples while he's out in the countryside, where we're told that he appeared to them in a different form. What does that mean? Very, very interesting, and there's no explanation given by Mark. That's slightly worrying. So all in all, this has the feel of material that was perhaps cobbled together from oral tradition and not necessarily actually written by the hand of Mark. Then we have to consider the sort of evidence from history. So this is really evidence that comes from the manuscripts themselves. And here's where I think it gets quite interesting, because these 12 verses, if indeed they were added really early on. Even though the two, and note this, the two earliest and most important manuscripts that we have of the Bible, which will be in your footnotes here. That's the argument they're making in the critical editions of the Bible. Even though those two manuscripts, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, do not include these verses, it must actually have been present in some manuscripts that predate these even, because verses from this ending get quoted by some of the very earliest church fathers. And one of those church fathers, Irenaeus, quotes from what we assume is the longer ending of Mark here, even before the end of the 2nd century. So that's really early, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's original, just very old. It might actually just mean that very early on, some people were really dissatisfied with the ending that Mark had given and felt, hey Mark, why have you left out some resurrection appearances? People need to know that Jesus met with people, was alive and physical. And so you can sort of understand why the ending was put in there. When we look at what we have in the oldest manuscript evidence then, we find that these verses are not found in the Old Latin version of the Bible. They're not in the Sinaitic Syriac. They are not in about 100 of the oldest Armenian manuscripts we have, and the two oldest Georgian manuscripts also don't include them. So there's a lot of texts, a lot of textual traditions and lines of transmission that these verses were not included in. And the fact of the matter is, though, that both the 3rd century historian Eusebius and the translator of the Latin Vulgate, Jerome, who put together the version of the Bible actually that was used in the West, for the Latin version that was used for about a millennium, both of those men, I mean, these are heavy hitters in the sort of Bible text world, they both testify that they knew about these verses, but that they were absent from the majority of the Greek texts that were known to them. Now, most compellingly, though, in my opinion, is the fact that this longer ending is not the only option you can go with, and that is slightly troubling. There are, in the manuscript evidence, 4 possible endings that you could go with for Mark. First of all, you could go with the ending that we have in our Bibles, which finishes at verse 8. That's one way you could look at it. Second option then is a short ending with just a single sentence in it about the women reporting to Peter and the apostles and then meeting Jesus and being sent out. It's about that big, yeah. And then you've got another ending, which we'll call the traditional ending, which has verses 9 to 20 added. So that's another possible ending there that you could have. That's the ending that you'd get in, say, the authorized version of the Bible. We'll call that traditional. And I suspect it's called the traditional ending largely because Jerome added it into the Vulgate, which was the main text for the Western Church for about 1,000 years. And then you've got another 4th option, which is an expanded version, which looks a bit more that kind of size. That's the expanded version, which has another substantial paragraph. Oops, it's falling down. Here, the one in the middle here, which is added after verse 14, which has got a whole load of weird stuff about the reign of Satan in it. So you've got 4 possible endings of Mark kicking about. And that I find slightly troubling. None of the rest of Mark has got those kind of options in it, just the ending here. Now, when you combine this data with the problems that are found in that internal evidence, the evidence from the text, I think it makes it most likely that the ending we have in our footnotes, and also included in the text of the King James Version, was not actually penned by Mark. That's the conclusion I've come to. The general consensus from the more sort of conservative scholars seemed to be that there was likely something that Mark did write here, which has been lost, perhaps. I don't particularly like that view, but anyway, some hypothesize that being on the last page, something might have been lost early on through damage, perhaps. One scholar goes so far as to suggest that perhaps during the persecutions of Nero, when this was likely being first written by Mark, that Mark lost his life in the persecutions and before he was able to finish his ending. That seems perhaps a little bit far-fetched. My own feeling is that the ending actually makes sense without any additions. Mark leaves us, doesn't he, in no doubt that Jesus has physically risen from the dead. Remember the young man saying, see where his body lay? The physical body is gone. He's raised physically. And his resurrection account corresponds actually here with his words to his disciples earlier in chapter 14, where he says, after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee, which is exactly what the angel, the young man, tells them. And as I pointed out on Sunday, Mark leaves us then with this short ending, with the challenge to decide not just who Jesus is, but what will we do with him? Will what we've seen in this gospel persuade us that surely this was the Son of God? Will we then remain distant observers with all of this information, or make that step of bold faith and commit ourselves to him? And will we remain fearful, or will we be his bold witnesses to the world? I think it's a great ending. Anyway, do feel free to ask any questions, to give me some feedback on this video, and God bless.